I was standing in the grand ballroom of Riverside Manor on what should have been a day of celebration when my father grabbed my arm hard enough to leave marks and told me to get out before I ruined everything. What he didn't know, as security escorted me past 300 mortified guests, was that I owned every inch of the $80,000 venue he just booked for my sister's perfect wedding. By Monday morning, he would understand exactly what he'd done. By the end of the month, their entire world would come crashing down in ways they never saw coming. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. The afternoon had started 6 hours earlier with me arriving at Riverside Manor through the service entrance, as I always did when we hosted events. Most brides and their families never realize that the woman checking final details with the catering staff, or adjusting the lighting in the ceremony space, was actually the owner of the premier wedding venue in Charleston, South Carolina. I preferred it that way. My business partner Marcus handled most client-facing interactions while I focused on operations and design, building a reputation for flawless execution that kept our calendar booked 18 months in advance at price points that made us one of the most expensive venues in the Southeast. This particular wedding was different from the hundreds of others I had overseen during the 5 years since I bought and renovated the historic property. This was my younger sister Vivian's wedding to her fiancé Brett Calloway, the heir to a commercial real estate fortune whose family connections made this union exactly the kind of achievement my parents had always valued. They had booked Riverside Manor 9 months earlier through our standard channels, and when Marcus processed their contract and deposit, he had called me immediately to ask how I wanted to handle the situation. I told him to treat them exactly like any other client, with no special consideration, and absolutely no indication that I had any connection to the venue beyond being an employee who might be working the event. My decision to remain invisible to my own family was not arbitrary or petty. It was strategic and rooted in 5 years of careful separation from people who had spent my entire childhood and young adulthood making clear that I was the disappointing daughter whose presence complicated their otherwise perfect family narrative. While Vivian excelled at everything that mattered to our parents, including beauty pageants, sorority leadership, and landing a wealthy husband before her 25th birthday, I had committed the unforgivable sins of being more interested in architectural history than fashion, choosing to study business and hospitality management instead of elementary education or nursing, and failing to produce an engagement ring by the time I graduated from college. The distance between us had calcified over the years through 1,000 small dismissals and a few large betrayals, but the final break had come 3 years earlier at Thanksgiving dinner, when my mother announced to the entire extended family that it was tragic I would probably end up alone since I was so focused on a career that would never love me back. My father had laughed and added that at least Vivian would give them grandchildren to make up for my selfishness. 22 relatives sat around that table, and not one person had defended me or suggested that my parents' comments were inappropriate. I had left before dessert was served and had not attended another family gathering since. During those 3 years of separation, I had built something they knew nothing about. The small event planning business I had started in college had evolved into ownership of Riverside Manor after the previous owners decided to retire, and I managed to secure financing that still felt miraculous when I thought about it. The property was a historic plantation house that had been converted to a wedding venue decades earlier, but had fallen into disrepair under management that lacked vision and capital. I had seen its potential immediately and had spent 2 years renovating every inch while learning the intricacies of historic preservation, high-end hospitality, and the specific demands of brides whose weddings cost more than most people's annual salaries. My parents knew I worked in event planning because they had made dismissive comments about it being a suitable job for someone who wasn't smart enough for law school or medical school. They had no idea that I owned anything, or that my business had become successful enough to generate 7-figure annual revenue. I had deliberately kept them in the dark by avoiding all social media that might reveal my professional accomplishments, and by ensuring that our family's few mutual connections knew better than to mention me in conversations with my parents. As far as my mother and father knew, I was still the struggling disappointment, barely making ends meet in a frivolous industry, while their golden daughter prepared for a wedding that would cement the family's social position. The irony of them choosing my venue for Vivian's wedding was not lost on me when Marcus had shown me the contract. They had selected Riverside Manor because it was exactly the kind of prestigious location that would impress their country club friends and business associates. The venue's reputation for exclusivity and elegance made it the perfect setting for the wedding my mother had probably been planning since Vivian's birth. The $80,000 venue fee alone was more than many people spent on entire weddings, but for my parents, the cost was worthwhile if it meant maintaining their carefully cultivated image of success and refinement. I had spent the morning of Vivian's wedding doing what I always did for major events, moving through the property to verify that every detail met my exacting standards. The ceremony space overlooking the Ashley River had been set with 300 white chairs arranged in perfect semicircles. The arbor was covered in white roses and hydrangeas that had cost more than $12,000. The reception ballroom gleamed with crystal chandeliers I had personally selected during the renovation, their light reflecting off silverware and china that represented another significant portion of the rental fee. Everything was perfect because I had built a business where perfection was the only acceptable standard. My plan had been to remain in the background as I always did during events, letting my staff handle any interactions with the family, while I monitored operations from the coordination office. I would watch my sister get married to her wealthy fiancé, observe my parents basking in their carefully constructed triumph, and then I would go home to my downtown Charleston apartment satisfied that I had provided excellent service to clients who happened to be related to me by blood if not by any meaningful emotional connection. It was a professional approach to a personal situation, and I had been confident I could maintain appropriate boundaries. That plan had lasted until approximately 4 in the afternoon, about 30 minutes before the ceremony was scheduled to begin. I had been in the bridal suite helping my assistant manager Carolina resolve a minor crisis with the bustle on Vivian's dress when my mother swept into the room and froze upon seeing me. Her face had cycled through confusion, recognition, and then immediate displeasure in the span of about 3 seconds. Her voice had been sharp when she asked what I was doing there, using a tone that suggested I had crashed the wedding, rather than being literally responsible for every aspect of its execution. I had explained calmly that I worked for the venue, and was part of the team ensuring everything ran smoothly. I watched her process this information with visible discomfort, her eyes narrowing as she calculated how my presence might affect her perfect day. She had turned to Vivian and asked if she was okay with me being there, phrasing the question in a way that clearly indicated what answer she expected. Vivian had looked at me for the first time in 3 years with an expression I could not quite read. We had been close as children despite our differences, and there had been a time when I thought she might be the one member of my family capable of seeing me as something other than a disappointment. But she had chosen our parents' narrative over our relationship, and I had accepted years ago that whatever sisterhood we might have had was a casualty of family dynamics that rewarded her for conformity and punished me for independence. She had told our mother that it was fine, that she didn't mind me being there as long as I stayed out of sight during the ceremony and reception. Her words had been delivered without cruelty, but also without any warmth or acknowledgement that we had once meant something to each other. I had nodded and left the bridal suite, returning to my office to monitor the ceremony via the security cameras we used to coordinate timing and logistics. The ceremony had been flawless from a technical standpoint. The string quartet had performed exactly on cue. The flower girls had walked down the aisle scattering petals with the adorable precision that made wedding guests reach for tissues. Vivian had looked genuinely beautiful in a dress that probably cost as much as a small car, and Brett had appeared appropriately emotional as she approached the arbor. My father had walked her down the aisle with the proud bearing of a man who believed he had successfully raised the perfect daughter, and my mother had dabbed at her eyes with a monogrammed handkerchief while accepting compliments from nearby guests about what a beautiful family they had. I had watched all of this on screens, feeling oddly detached from what should have been an emotional experience. This was my sister getting married in a venue I had created through years of work and vision. These were my parents celebrating in a space I owned, surrounded by beauty I had designed, completely unaware that the daughter they had dismissed was responsible for every detail they were praising. The disconnect between their perception and reality should have felt vindicating, but instead it just felt empty. The problem had started during the cocktail hour when guests moved from the ceremony space to the terrace for drinks and appetizers. I had been doing a final walkthrough of the reception ballroom, checking that place cards were positioned correctly and that the elaborate centerpieces were precisely centered on tables, when my father had appeared in the doorway with my Uncle Richard, his older brother and business partner. They had been discussing something about a real estate deal. their voices carrying the easy confidence of men who had never questioned their right to occupy any space they entered. I had tried to slip past them without drawing attention, but my father had looked directly at me with the vague recognition of someone who knew they should know a person but could not quite place them. Then his expression had shifted to shocked recognition, followed immediately by anger. He had demanded to know what I was doing at Vivian's wedding, his voice already rising in a way that suggested he was working himself into one of his controlled rages. I had explained again that I worked for the venue, keeping my voice calm and professional. He had responded by saying that my presence was inappropriate and disruptive, that I should have known better than to put Vivian in the uncomfortable position of having me around on her special day, and that I needed to leave immediately before anyone else noticed me. I had stood there in the ballroom I owned, surrounded by the carefully curated elegance I had created, and listened to my father order me to leave what was legally my property. The absurdity of the situation had been almost overwhelming. Every chandelier he was standing under, every piece of furniture in the room, every flower arrangement guests were photographing had been purchased with my money and arranged according to my vision. The $80,000 he had paid for the privilege of hosting his daughter's wedding here had gone directly into my business accounts. And he was ordering me out like I was an intruder who had wandered in off the street. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel, it means a lot to us. Now back to the story. I had tried one more time to explain that I was working and had every right to be present, but he had cut me off by grabbing my arm and steering me toward the service corridor. His grip had been tight enough to hurt, his fingers digging into my bicep in a way that would definitely leave bruises. He had been muttering about how I always found ways to make everything about myself, how I could not let Vivian have one day without creating drama, how typical it was that I would show up uninvited to cause problems. The irony was so thick I could barely breathe around it. I had not shown up uninvited. I owned the venue. I had created the beautiful setting that was making his daughter's wedding the social triumph he wanted it to be. I had spent months overseeing every detail to ensure this event met the standards that justified our premium pricing. And he was physically removing me while accusing me of being an attention-seeking troublemaker. We had emerged from the service corridor into the main hallway just as cocktail hour was transitioning to dinner service, which meant there were approximately 50 guests moving between spaces. My father had not lowered his voice or released his painful grip on my arm. He had announced loudly enough for everyone nearby to hear that I needed to leave before I ruined everything, that I had not been invited and had no business being there, that my presence was selfish and inappropriate. I had seen the faces of my parents' friends and colleagues register shock, and then carefully neutral expressions as they witnessed this scene. Some of them had known me as a child. A few had probably attended my high school graduation or sent perfunctory congratulations when I graduated from college. Now they were watching my father physically escort me out of what they believed was simply a venue where I was inappropriately present, and not one of them had intervened or questioned whether his behavior was acceptable. My mother had appeared then, drawn by the commotion, and her face had reflected pure horror at the scene we were creating in front of their social circle. She had immediately sided with my father, telling me in a harsh whisper that I should be ashamed of myself for trying to ruin Vivian's day, that she did not know what was wrong with me, that I could not let my sister have one moment without making it about my own need for attention. She had turned to nearby guests with an apologetic smile and made some comment about family drama, laughing it off in a way that positioned me as the unstable relative they unfortunately had to deal with. Security had arrived then because our head of security Tom had been monitoring cameras and had seen the altercation developing. He had approached professionally and asked if there was a problem he could help resolve. My father had told him that I was trespassing and needed to be removed from the property immediately. I had caught Tom's eye and given him a tiny shake of my head, signaling that he should not reveal my identity as the owner. He had understood immediately and had very professionally asked me to come with him, gently extracting me from my father's grip and escorting me toward the main entrance. The walk through the venue to the front doors had felt endless. I had been acutely aware of every guest who paused their conversation to watch the scene, every judgmental glance, every whispered comment. These people were seeing the daughter being removed from her sister's wedding by security, and making assumptions about what that meant about my character and my family relationships. They were witnessing what appeared to be justified exclusion of someone who had caused problems, not knowing that the person being escorted out owned every square foot of the property they were standing on. Tom had walked me all the way to my car in the staff parking lot. His face carefully neutral but his eyes reflecting concern and barely suppressed anger on my behalf. He had asked quietly if I was okay, and whether I wanted him to go back inside and tell them exactly who they had just thrown out. I had told him no, that I wanted him to ensure the event continued flawlessly because that was what we were being paid to do, and because I was not going to let my personal situation compromise our professional reputation. He had nodded but had said something that stuck with me as I drove away. He had said that sometimes the best revenge was not revenge at all, but simply letting people face the natural consequences of their actions without interference. He had promised that when my parents inevitably discovered the truth about who owned Riverside Manor, he would be there to witness their faces and would describe the moment to me in detail. Then he had returned to work and I had sat in my car for 10 minutes trying to stop shaking before I trusted myself to drive. The drive back to my apartment should have taken 20 minutes, but I pulled over twice because my hands were trembling too badly to grip the steering wheel safely. The first time I stopped in a grocery store parking lot and called Marcus, my business partner and closest friend, who answered on the first ring despite being on vacation in Colorado. I had told him what happened in a voice that sounded disconnected from my body, recounting the events with a strange detachment that worried him enough that he offered to fly back immediately. I had told him to stay where he was, that I was fine, that I just needed to process what had happened. The second time I stopped I just cried in the parking lot of a random office building. Ugly sobbing tears that came from somewhere deep and primal. I cried for the little girl who had tried so hard to earn love from parents who seemed incapable of giving it to her. I cried for the years of effort I had put into being good enough, smart enough, successful enough to warrant basic respect and recognition. I cried for the relationship with my sister that had withered and died under the weight of our parents' favoritism. And I cried because I had just been physically removed from my own property by my own father while my own mother watched and approved. When I finally made it back to my apartment, I sat on my couch still wearing the professional black dress and low heels that constituted my work uniform and stared at nothing for nearly an hour. My phone had buzzed repeatedly with messages from Carolina and other staff members asking if I was okay and expressing outrage at what had happened. Tom had sent a message saying that dinner service was proceeding normally, and that none of the guests seemed to have any idea anything was wrong beyond whatever family drama they thought they had witnessed. Everything at Riverside Manor was running smoothly because I had built systems and trained staff capable of excellence even in my absence. But I was not at my venue overseeing my sister's wedding. I was in my apartment nursing bruises on my arm where my father had grabbed me and trying to understand how I had ended up here. How had I become the daughter so disappointing that her mere presence was considered disruptive? How had I become so invisible that my own parents could book and pay for my venue without having any idea I owned it? How had 3 years of separation resulted in them knowing so little about my life that they could stand in a building I owned and order me out of it? The answer was complicated and rooted in patterns that had developed over decades, but part of it was my own choice. I had deliberately kept them ignorant about my success because some part of me had wanted to avoid their judgment and inevitable dismissal of my accomplishments. I had known that if they learned I owned Riverside Manor, my mother would find ways to minimize the achievement and my father would immediately begin offering unsolicited business advice that revealed his assumption that I was not capable of managing my own company. So I had simply never told them, had removed myself from their lives so thoroughly that they had no idea who I had become. But sitting in my apartment that evening, I realized that my strategy of invisible success had backfired spectacularly. By keeping them ignorant, I had enabled them to continue treating me as the disappointment they believed me to be. They felt completely justified removing me from what they thought was just another venue where I was a low-level employee causing problems. They had no idea that their actions had consequences beyond hurt feelings, that they had just made a very expensive mistake that would cost them far more than the $80,000 they had already paid. As the evening progressed and I received updates from staff that the reception was beautiful and the client seemed very satisfied, I made a decision about how I would handle this situation. I was not going to call them immediately and reveal the truth in the heat of emotional reaction. I was not going to confront them at the venue or create a scene that would actually ruin Vivian's wedding. I was going to be strategic and measured. I was going to let them have their perfect evening celebrating their perfect daughter in the venue they loved, completely unaware of what was coming. But Monday morning everything would change. Monday morning they would receive a letter from Riverside Manor's attorney along with detailed documentation about ownership, financial arrangements, and their daughter's wedding. They would learn that every time they had praised the venue's beauty and exclusivity to their friends, they had been unknowingly praising my work and my vision. They would understand that when they had thrown me out, they had literally ejected the owner of the property from her own business. And they would discover that their actions had consequences they had not anticipated. I spent Sunday in my apartment drafting the letter with my attorney Michael Chun, who I had called despite it being the weekend. He had been furious on my behalf when I explained what had happened, and had immediately agreed to help craft a communication that was legally precise and professionally devastating. We worked for several hours to ensure every word was carefully chosen to deliver maximum impact, while remaining absolutely factual and legally sound. The letter did not threaten legal action because technically they had not done anything illegal by asking me to leave what they thought was just a workplace. The letter simply provided information they apparently did not have, explaining that I was the owner of Riverside Manor and had been for 5 years, that the $80,000 they had paid for Vivian's wedding had been paid to my company, and that their decision to have me physically removed from the property I owned would necessarily impact our future business relationship. Michael had suggested including financial documentation showing my ownership, photographs of me during the renovation process, media coverage that had featured Riverside Manor under my leadership, and testimonials from other clients about my personal involvement in their events. By the time we finished, the packet of information was nearly 40 pages long and painted an undeniable picture of who I was and what I had built while they had remained obliviously certain of my failure. The letter would be delivered by courier Monday morning at 10 o'clock to ensure both my parents would be home and would receive it together. I wanted them to have the weekend to bask in the glow of what they believed was a successful wedding before reality crashed over them. I wanted them to spend Sunday showing off pictures to friends and basking in compliments about the venue and the event before they learned the truth about who had made that beauty possible. I wanted them to have one more day of their comfortable assumptions before everything changed. As I finalized the arrangement Sunday evening, I felt something shift inside me that was not quite satisfaction but was close to it. For years I had absorbed their dismissal and judgment, had internalized their messages that I was the disappointing child who could not measure up to their standards. I had let their perception of me as a failure coexist with my knowledge of my actual success because confronting the disconnect felt too difficult and too painful. But they had made that impossible now by physically removing me from my own property, while announcing to their entire social circle that I was inappropriate and disruptive. They had forced this confrontation through their own actions, and now they would face the consequences of having been so certain of my insignificance that they had never bothered to learn the truth about my life. They were about to discover that the daughter they had dismissed had built something they admired enough to spend $80,000 celebrating inside. They were going to learn that their judgment of me had been based on willful ignorance rather than actual assessment of who I was or what I was capable of achieving. And most importantly, they were going to understand that I had been holding their world together in ways they never knew while they treated me as someone whose presence was a problem to be managed rather than a person whose contributions had value. The foundation they had been standing on was built by the daughter they had thrown away, and they were about to feel it crumble beneath their feet in ways they never anticipated. I went to bed Sunday night knowing that Monday would be the day everything changed, that the comfortable fiction my parents had maintained about their disappointing daughter and their perfect family was about to shatter. I felt no guilt about what was coming because I had not created this situation. They had built these circumstances through years of dismissal, and through the specific action of having me removed from my own property. I was simply going to make sure they finally saw the reality they had been too blind or too comfortable to notice on their own. The truth was coming whether they were ready for it or not. And I was done protecting them from the consequences of their own willful ignorance about who their daughter actually was. The Sunday after Vivian's wedding passed with an excruciating slowness that made every hour feel like it lasted days. I woke early despite having barely slept, my body apparently convinced that lying awake staring at the ceiling counted as rest. The bruises on my arm where my father had grabbed me had darkened overnight into purple-blue marks that formed a perfect impression of his fingers, physical evidence of the violence that had accompanied my removal from my own property. I photographed them carefully with my phone, not because I planned to pursue any legal action, but because I wanted documentation of what had happened before the marks faded, and the moment could be rewritten or minimized in family mythology. My apartment felt both too large and too confining as I moved through it, trying to occupy myself with mundane tasks that required no emotional energy. I cleaned counters that were already spotless, reorganized closets that needed no reorganization, and made myself eat food that tasted like cardboard because my body needed fuel even though my appetite had disappeared completely. The physical activities provided a rhythm and structure that kept me from spiraling into the kind of obsessive mental loops that would accomplish nothing except making me feel worse. Marcus called 3 times throughout the day from Colorado, where he was supposedly on vacation, but was clearly spending most of his mental energy worrying about me and the situation unfolding back in Charleston. During our third conversation, he floated the idea of cutting his trip short and returning early to provide support, but I had insisted that he stay and finish the vacation he had been planning for months. There was nothing he could do by being physically present that would change anything about tomorrow's revelation, or make processing this situation any easier. I needed to sit with my own feelings rather than using his presence as a distraction from the internal work I knew was necessary. Carolina had texted earlier in the day to let me know that the breakdown and cleanup at Riverside Manor had proceeded flawlessly, that every rental item had been accounted for and returned to vendors, that the property had been restored to its pristine baseline condition, and that she had personally done a final walkthrough to ensure nothing had been missed. She had also mentioned that several guests had approached her during the reception to compliment the venue and ask for business cards, which meant that even as I was being escorted out by security, my business was generating future bookings from people who had been impressed by what they experienced. The professional success felt hollow in the moment, but I recognized intellectually that it mattered and would continue to matter once I had processed the emotional devastation of the personal situation. Tom had sent a longer message describing the remainder of the evening after my departure, providing details I had not asked for but that he apparently felt I needed to know. He reported that my parents had returned to the reception acting as though nothing significant had happened, that they had moved through the evening with practiced social grace, accepting compliments and posing for photographs and delivering toasts that celebrated Vivian and Brett with appropriate parental pride. My mother had apparently told several people who inquired about the earlier commotion that it was just an unfortunate situation with a former employee who had boundary issues, an explanation that simultaneously dismissed the incident and positioned me as someone with professional or personal problems that explained my inappropriate presence. The ease with which they had erased me from the narrative and continued with their celebration stung in ways I had not fully anticipated. Some part of me had apparently been hoping they might feel guilt or at least discomfort about what had happened, that they might spend the rest of the evening distracted or troubled by having physically removed their daughter from what they believed was her workplace. But they had simply moved on as though the incident was nothing more than a minor inconvenience, as disposable and forgettable as I had always been in their eyes. They had gone on to enjoy every moment of Vivian's reception, oblivious to the reality of what they had actually done and unconcerned about how their actions might have affected me. I spent part of Sunday afternoon reviewing the documentation that Michael Chen and I had compiled for Monday's delivery, reading through the 40-page packet one final time to ensure every detail was accurate and that the overall narrative was clear and undeniable. The packet opened with a cover letter written on Riverside Manor letterhead, explaining in formal business language that there appeared to be some confusion about ownership and operational structure of the venue, and that we were providing comprehensive information to clarify the situation and ensure all parties had accurate understanding going forward. The subsequent pages included the original purchase agreement showing my acquisition of the property 5 years earlier, business registration documents listing me as owner and CEO, financial statements that had been prepared by our accounting firm showing revenue growth and business success over multiple years, photographs documenting the extensive renovation I had overseen, media articles from Charleston business publications, and wedding industry magazines that featured Riverside Manor and identified me by name as the owner, testimonials from satisfied clients that specifically mentioned my personal involvement in their events, and finally a copy of my parents' own contract for Vivian's wedding complete with my signature as the authorized representative of Riverside Manor. The weight of evidence was overwhelming and irrefutable. There would be no room for them to claim misunderstanding or to minimize the significance of what the documentation revealed. They would be forced to confront the reality that the daughter they had dismissed as a failure had built a business successful enough to be featured in regional and national publications, had created a venue beautiful enough to be their first choice for their most important family event, and had been competent enough to execute a wedding that apparently met their exacting standards, since I had not heard any complaints about the quality of the event itself. Michael had insisted on including one additional element that made me uncomfortable, but that he argued was necessary for full impact. He had compiled a timeline showing the correlation between my 3-year absence from family events and the growth trajectory of my business, demonstrating that the period during which they had no contact with me was precisely the period during which I had achieved my greatest professional success. The timeline made visually clear that I had not needed their support or approval or involvement to build something significant, that in fact my achievements had flourished specifically during the time when I was free from their judgment and dismissal. The implicit message was that their absence from my life had been a benefit rather than a loss, that I had thrived when released from the weight of constantly trying to earn love from people who were determined not to give it. Michael believed this framing was important because it preempted any attempt by my parents to rewrite the narrative as one where they had actually been supportive all along, or where my success was somehow attributable to values or work ethic they had instilled in me. The timeline made clear that whatever I had built without them and in spite of them rather than because of them. As Sunday afternoon faded into evening, I found myself thinking about the broader patterns that had led to this specific moment of crisis. The physical removal from my sister's wedding was dramatic and public, but it was actually just the most visible manifestation of dynamics that had been operating for my entire life. I had always been the child who did not quite fit the mold my parents had cast, whose interests and strengths did not align with their vision of what a daughter should be. Vivian had intuited early what was required to earn their approval, and had shaped herself accordingly, making choices that reinforced their preferences and values. I had tried that approach for years before eventually accepting that I could not authentically be the person they wanted me to be, that attempting to contort myself into their preferred shape was destroying me from the inside. The decision to separate from them 3 years ago had been an act of self-preservation rather than rebellion or rejection. I had needed distance to figure out who I actually was when I was not constantly trying to earn approval that was never going to come. I had needed space to build a life based on my own values and interests rather than on desperate attempts to finally be good enough in their eyes. And I had needed freedom from their constant subtle and not-so-subtle messages that I was a disappointment in order to develop any kind of healthy self-concept that was not rooted entirely in shame about failing to meet standards that had never been reasonable or achievable in the first place. The irony was that the separation they had made me feel guilty about had actually been the precondition for my success. Without their voices in my head constantly telling me I was not good enough, not feminine enough, not conventional enough, not successful in the ways that mattered, I had been able to take risks and make choices based on my own judgment rather than on fear of their disapproval. I had pursued the opportunity to purchase Riverside Manor because I believed in my vision for what it could become, not because I had calculated whether my parents would view property ownership as an appropriately impressive achievement. I had made business decisions based on what I knew about the industry and about creating exceptional client experiences, rather than on what would sound good when described at their country club social events. The business I had built was authentically mine in ways that would not have been possible if I had remained enmeshed in their world and their expectations. And now they were about to discover that the daughter they had written off as an embarrassing failure had created something they literally valued enough to spend $80,000 celebrating inside. The cognitive dissonance they were about to experience felt like justice, even though I recognized that framing this as being about revenge or vindication was probably not the healthiest way to process what was happening. Dr. Patricia Wells, the therapist I had been seeing for about 2 years as part of my ongoing process of understanding and healing from family dysfunction, would probably encourage me to examine what I actually wanted to achieve by sending the documentation packet. Was I hoping they would finally see my worth and transform into people capable of genuine love and support? Was I trying to hurt them by forcing them to confront their own blindness and cruelty? Was I attempting to establish some kind of new relationship dynamic based on accurate information and appropriate boundaries? Or was I simply ensuring they understood the full impact of their actions so that future choices would be made with complete rather than partial information? The honest answer was probably some combination of all those motivations plus others I had not fully acknowledged to myself. I wanted them to know the truth because secrets and hidden information had enabled the dysfunction for too long. I wanted them to face consequences for physically removing me from my own property, because actions should have consequences, And they had operated too long in a consequence-free environment where their behavior toward me never cost them anything they valued. I wanted them to experience even a fraction of the shock and disorientation I had felt being grabbed and escorted out in front of 300 people, who now had completely incorrect assumptions about my character and my family relationships. But underneath all of that, some wounded part of me that I was not particularly proud of still wanted them to be impressed. I wanted them to look at the evidence of what I had built and feel amazed or proud, or at least forced to acknowledge that they had been wrong about me. I wanted them to see that the daughter they had dismissed was actually more successful than they had realized, that the career they had mocked as frivolous was actually lucrative and prestigious, that the choices they had criticized had led to achievements that met any reasonable definition of success. I wanted external validation from the two people whose validation I had spent my entire life seeking and never receiving. Dr. Wells would probably point out that wanting their approval was natural and understandable, but that basing my sense of self-worth on whether or not they finally provided it was a trap that would keep me emotionally dependent on people who had proven themselves incapable of meeting my legitimate needs for recognition and respect. She would encourage me to find the validation internally, to recognize my own achievements independent of whether my parents acknowledged them, to build my sense of worth on my own assessment of my character and capabilities rather than on their belated recognition of what had always been true about me. I knew she would be right about all of that, but knowing something intellectually and being able to actually embody it emotionally were very different things. I could recognize that my parents' opinions about me said more about their limitations than about my actual worth, but that recognition did not make me stop wanting them to finally see me clearly and respond to what they saw with something other than dismissal or disappointment. The little girl inside me who had tried so hard to earn their love was still there, still hoping that maybe this time would be different, still believing that if the evidence was overwhelming enough they would have to acknowledge that they had been wrong. Monday morning arrived with the kind of crisp clarity that made Charleston beautiful despite the humidity that would build as the day progressed. I woke at dawn without needing an alarm, my body apparently aware that today was significant even though my conscious mind was trying to approach it as just another ordinary day. I went through my morning routine with deliberate attention to each small task, making coffee with precise measurements, choosing professional attire that projected competence and authority, applying makeup that would look polished on the video calls I had scheduled for the afternoon. The courier service had confirmed they would deliver the packet to my parents' address at exactly 10 o'clock, which meant they would receive it while my father was likely working from his home office and my mother was probably having her post-breakfast coffee while reading emails or planning her day. I had timed the delivery deliberately to ensure they would be together, that they would open it simultaneously rather than one of them receiving information first and having time to shape how it was presented to the other. I wanted them to experience the revelation at the same moment without any filtering or interpretation from each other. Marcus called at 8:30 to check in and ask if I wanted him to come to my apartment to provide moral support during the actual delivery time. I appreciated the offer but declined, explaining that I needed to sit with whatever emotions emerged, without having someone else present who would need me to manage their feelings about my situation in addition to processing my own. He understood immediately and simply told me to call him whenever I wanted to talk, that he would keep his schedule clear for the entire day, and was available anytime I needed him. His unconditional support without pressure or expectation stood in such stark contrast to my family relationships that I felt a wave of gratitude that threatened to undo my carefully maintained composure. Carolina sent a text at 9 asking if there was anything she could do, and whether I wanted her to be on alert for any contact from my family who might call Riverside Manor once they received the information packet. I told her to route any calls directly to my cell phone and to instruct all other staff members to do the same, that I wanted to control all communication with my parents and did not want them attempting to get information or explanations from my employees. She confirmed she would brief the entire team and ensure everyone understood that any inquiries from the Foster family should be redirected immediately to me without discussion. At 9:45, I positioned myself on my couch with my phone fully charged and my laptop open to my email in case they chose written communication rather than calling directly. I had no idea how they would respond to the information they were about to receive. They might call immediately in shock or anger. They might wait hours or days while they processed the revelation and decided how to address it. They might attempt to minimize or explain away what the documentation clearly showed. They might become defensive and angry that I had deceived them by not revealing my ownership. They might even try to claim they had suspected all along or had somehow actually known without explicitly acknowledging it. What they almost certainly would not do was respond with genuine apology or accountability for having physically removed me from my own property, because that would require them to admit they had made a significant error in judgment and to acknowledge that their assumptions about my failure and insignificance had been completely wrong. In my entire life, I could not remember either of my parents ever offering an authentic apology that did not include justifications or deflections or attempts to make me partially responsible for their behavior. The pattern was so established that I would have been more surprised by genuine accountability than by any defensive or minimizing response they might offer. At exactly 10 o'clock according to the clock on my laptop, my phone buzzed with a notification from the courier service confirming delivery, and including a digital signature showing that someone at my parents' address had accepted the package. The notification included a timestamp showing the packet had been signed for at 9:58 a.m., which meant it had actually arrived slightly early, and they had it in their possession right now. I imagined my mother carrying the unexpected delivery to wherever my father was working, both of them curious about what had arrived via courier on a Monday morning. I imagined them opening the envelope together and beginning to read the cover letter with its formal explanation about clarifying ownership structure and operational details. I imagined the moment when recognition would hit them, when they would realize that the information they were reading was not about some unrelated business matter, but was directly about Riverside Manor and about me. I imagined their faces as they turned pages and saw documentation of my ownership, saw photographs of me during the renovation process, saw media coverage identifying me as the owner and CEO. I imagined the dawning realization that every compliment they had given about the venue's beauty, every time they had boasted to friends about hosting Vivian's wedding at such an exclusive location, every moment they had spent basking in the reflected prestige of the property had actually been acknowledgement of my work and my vision even though they had not known it. The minutes ticked by with excruciating slowness. 10:15 came and went with no contact. 10:30 arrived with my phone remaining silent. By 11 o'clock, I was simultaneously relieved and disappointed that they had not immediately called, uncertain whether their silence meant they needed time to process or whether they were coordinating their response or whether they were simply in such shock that they could not yet formulate words. I forced myself to eat lunch despite having no appetite, recognizing that I needed to maintain basic physical care, regardless of my emotional state. At 1:30, my phone finally rang with my mother's number appearing on the screen. I let it ring 3 times while I took deep breaths and centered myself, reminding myself that I was not the child who needed their approval, and that I was approaching this conversation as an adult with appropriate boundaries who would not accept responsibility for their feelings about information they should have had all along. On the 4th ring, I answered with a simple neutral greeting that did not convey either hostility or warmth. My mother's voice was tight and controlled in the way it always became when she was very angry but was attempting to maintain civility. She asked if I had sent the packet of information they had received that morning, phrasing the question as though she suspected there might be some mistake or confusion about who had initiated the communication. I confirmed that yes, I had sent it through my attorney because the events of Saturday evening made clear that they did not have accurate information about my professional situation, and I felt it was important they understand the full context of what had occurred. There was a long pause during which I could hear my father's voice in the background saying something I could not distinguish. Then my mother spoke again, her tone shifting from controlled anger to something more complex that might have been embarrassment or discomfort. She said they had been very surprised to learn about my ownership of Riverside Manor, that they had no idea I had been so successful, that if they had known I owned the venue they never would have booked it for Vivian's wedding because they would not have wanted to put me in the awkward position of working my own sister's wedding. The framing was remarkable in its complete inversion of reality. She was positioning their ignorance as my failure to inform them rather than as their complete lack of interest in or knowledge about my life. She was suggesting that I had somehow been harmed by working the wedding rather than acknowledging that I had been physically removed from my own property. She was making the situation about their discomfort at having unknowingly patronized my business rather than about their behavior in having me escorted out by security. Every word was carefully chosen to avoid taking any responsibility for their actions while simultaneously expressing concern that positioned them as considerate people who would have made different choices if only they had been properly informed. I let her finish her entire monologue before responding, using the silence to gather my thoughts and decide how much I was willing to engage with her reframing. When I finally spoke, I kept my voice calm and factual, explaining that I had not informed them about my ownership specifically because we had not been in contact for 3 years by their choice and my agreement, that during that time I had built a business that I was proud of, that their decision to book Riverside Manor had been their own choice based on the venue's reputation, and they had received exactly the level of service they had paid for. I pointed out that I had not created any awkwardness by working the event, but that they had created a problem by having me physically removed from property I owned. My father took the phone then, his voice carrying the authoritative tone he used when he expected immediate compliance with his perspective. He said I was being dramatic about what had happened on Saturday, that he had simply asked me to leave because my presence was making Vivian uncomfortable on her wedding day, that any reasonable person would understand why a bride might not want her estranged sister hovering around during her reception. He suggested that I was trying to create a situation where I was the victim when in fact I had put everyone in an uncomfortable position by being present at all. The gaslighting was so textbook that I almost laughed at the transparency of the technique. He was rewriting what had happened, erasing the physicality of how he had grabbed my arm hard enough to leave bruises, minimizing the public humiliation of being escorted out by security in front of 300 guests, and most remarkably claiming that I had put people in an uncomfortable position by being present at my own place of business during an event my company was contracted to execute. He was making my presence rather than his response to my presence the problem, and he was doing it with such confidence that someone who had not been there might actually accept his version of events as accurate. I made a decision in that moment about how I wanted to handle this conversation, and all future conversations with my parents. I was not going to argue about whose version of events was correct or try to convince them that their behavior had been inappropriate. I was not going to defend myself against accusations that I had created drama or made Vivian uncomfortable. I was simply going to state facts and allow those facts to stand without elaboration or justification. I told them that the bruises on my arm from where my father had grabbed me told a different story than the one he was currently presenting, but that I was not interested in debating what had happened since we both had been present and knew the truth regardless of how we chose to describe it. I explained that my purpose in sending the documentation was simply to ensure they had complete information about who owned the venue where they had hosted their daughter's wedding, and where they had chosen to have me removed. I noted that any future business decisions they made regarding Riverside Manor would now be made with full knowledge of the ownership structure, which was as it should be. My mother tried to interrupt with something about how they never would have caused a scene if they had known, but I continued speaking over her without raising my voice or changing my calm tone. I said that I hoped Vivian's wedding had been everything they wanted it to be, that based on staff reports the event had been executed flawlessly, and that I was glad they had been satisfied with the venue and service. I mentioned that our contract had been fulfilled completely, and that their final invoice would reflect only the agreed-upon charges with no adjustments despite the unusual circumstances of the family relationship. Then I told them that I needed to end the call because I had scheduled business calls that afternoon, but that they should feel free to contact me via email if they had any questions about the information in the documentation packet. Before either of them could respond, I ended the call and immediately turned off my phone's ringer so that any subsequent attempts to call back would go directly to voicemail without disturbing me. My hands were shaking as I set the phone down on my coffee table, adrenaline flooding my system in response to the stress of the conversation, even though outwardly, I had maintained complete composure. I had done what I needed to do by refusing to accept their reframing, and by maintaining clear boundaries about what I would and would not discuss. I had not given them the satisfaction of an emotional response or defensive explanations. I had simply stated facts and ended the conversation on my own terms, rather than allowing it to continue until they felt satisfied they had adequately explained away, or minimized their behavior. But my body was paying the price for that emotional control, my heart racing and my breathing shallow in ways that signaled my nervous system was in fight or flight mode despite the absence of any immediate physical threat. I spent the next hour doing breathing exercises and progressive muscle relaxation techniques that Dr. Wells had taught me, gradually bringing my physiological responses back to baseline so that I could function for the rest of the day. The business calls I had mentioned to my parents were real, and I forced myself to show up fully present and professional for discussions about upcoming events and vendor contracts. My clients deserved my best regardless of what was happening in my personal life, and maintaining that professional standard gave me something concrete to focus on beyond my family situation. By the time I finished the last call at 5 o'clock, I felt exhausted but also oddly peaceful, as though some internal tension I had been carrying for years had finally released, even though I knew the situation with my parents was far from resolved. Marcus called that evening and I walked him through the entire day, including the delivery confirmation, the hours of waiting, the eventual call from my parents, and my decision about how to handle their attempt to reframe what had happened. He listened without interruption until I finished, then said something that crystallized what I had been feeling but had not yet articulated. He said that I had just demonstrated exactly the kind of boundaries and self-respect that had enabled me to build a successful business, that the same qualities that made me good at my work were the qualities my parents had always criticized because those qualities made me harder to control and manipulate. He was right. The assertiveness, clear communication, refusal to accept unreasonable demands, and insistence on accurate information that served me well in business were exactly the traits that had made me a disappointment to parents who expected compliance, and who wanted daughters who derived their identity entirely from family approval, rather than from internal sense of worth. I had been punished my entire life for being exactly the kind of person who was capable of succeeding on my own terms, and now that success was forcing them to confront the limitations of their own judgment and the cost of their dismissive treatment. As Monday evening faded into night, I reflected on what had shifted over the course of this one day. My parents now knew the truth about who I was professionally, which meant they could never again comfort themselves with the assumption that I had failed while they succeeded. They would have to live with the knowledge that they had been wrong about me, that they had systematically underestimated and dismissed someone who had built something impressive by any objective standard. That knowledge would not transform them into different people or suddenly make them capable of genuine love and support, but it would at minimum force them to update their narrative about the disappointing daughter to account for inconvenient facts about her actual capabilities and achievements. I went to bed Monday night feeling something I had not felt in years when thinking about my family. Not happiness or satisfaction exactly, but a kind of solid groundedness that came from finally standing in my own truth without apology or qualification. They knew now. There was no more hiding or protecting them from information that might force them to reconsider their assumptions. Whatever happened next would unfold with all parties operating from the same factual foundation, which felt like progress even though I recognized that shared knowledge did not guarantee positive outcomes. The truth was out there now, permanent and undeniable, and for better or worse, we would all have to figure out how to move forward from this new reality where the invisible daughter had become impossible to ignore. The week following Monday's revelation unfolded with a strange mixture of normalcy and underlying tension that made every ordinary task feel weighted with significance. I returned to my regular schedule of managing Riverside Manor operations, meeting with prospective clients, overseeing current event preparations, and handling the administrative details that kept a business of our size functioning smoothly. On the surface, everything appeared exactly as it had been before Vivian's wedding, but internally I felt fundamentally changed in ways I was still processing and trying to understand. My parents did not attempt to contact me again after that initial Monday phone call, which surprised me more than I wanted to admit. Some part of me had expected ongoing attempts at communication as they worked through their shock, and tried to manage the situation in whatever way would be most comfortable for them. The silence felt both like relief and like confirmation of something I had always suspected, that their interest in me was conditional on my fitting into their preferred narrative, and that once I disrupted that narrative too significantly, they simply did not know how to engage with me at all. Carolina reported on Wednesday that we had received a formal 5-star review through our website from someone named Margaret Calloway, who I recognized as Brett's mother and therefore Vivian's new mother-in-law. The review praised every aspect of Riverside Manor in glowing terms, specifically mentioning the attention to detail, the seamless execution, the beauty of the property, and the professionalism of the staff. She had included several sentences about how the venue had made her son's wedding absolutely perfect, and had exceeded every expectation their family had for such an important occasion. Reading the review gave me an odd feeling of vindication mixed with sadness because apparently Brett's mother had recognized and appreciated the quality of what we provided even though my own parents had never acknowledged my professional capabilities despite having literally experienced the results. Marcus returned from Colorado on Thursday, and immediately came to my apartment bearing coffee and pastries from my favorite bakery, settling onto my couch with the clear intention of not leaving until we had talked through everything that had happened during his absence. I walked him through the entire sequence of events with more emotional honesty than I had allowed myself during the crisis itself, admitting how much it had hurt to be physically removed by my own father, and how the bruises on my arm felt like a visible manifestation of invisible wounds that had been accumulating for decades. He listened with the kind of complete presence that made him such an effective business partner and such a valuable friend, asking clarifying questions when he needed more context but mostly just creating space for me to process aloud. When I finished, he said something that caught me off guard with its perceptiveness. He noted that the documentation packet we had sent my parents was comprehensive about my professional achievements, but had included nothing about my personal life. Nothing about the friendships I had built or the community I had created or the ways I had developed into someone with depth and character beyond just business success. He was right, and his observation made me realize that I had unconsciously accepted my parents' framing that my worth needed to be measured primarily through professional achievement and financial success. I had sent them evidence of business accomplishments as though proving I was successful in conventional economic terms would force them to acknowledge my value, but I had not included anything about who I had become as a person or what kind of life I had built beyond the metrics they would understand and respect. The omission revealed that despite years of therapy and conscious work on developing internal rather than external validation, I was still to some degree performing for their approval using standards I did not actually believe in but that I knew they would recognize as legitimate measures of success. Friday afternoon brought an unexpected development that would shift my understanding of my own history in ways I had not anticipated. I received a phone call from a woman named Eleanor Martinez who identified herself as an estate attorney in Savannah, Georgia. She explained that she was handling the estate of a man named Robert Chun who had passed away 3 weeks earlier after a brief illness, and that her client had left specific instructions that I was to be contacted after his death. The name meant nothing to me initially, and I told her so with some confusion about why someone I did not know would have left me anything or would have wanted me contacted. Eleanor's voice took on a gentler tone as she explained that Robert Chun had been a close friend and business associate of someone I had known, though she was not at liberty to provide more details over the phone. She asked if I would be willing to meet with her in person to receive materials that Mr. Chun had left for me, materials that apparently included a letter explaining the connection and providing information he had felt was important for me to have. Her careful phrasing and obvious discomfort with the topic made clear that whatever information awaited me was significant and potentially emotional, and that she had been specifically instructed to handle the delivery with sensitivity. I agreed to meet her the following Tuesday at her office in Savannah, which was about 2 hours from Charleston and would require me to block out most of the afternoon. The drive would give me time to think, and honestly I welcomed the excuse to leave Charleston for a few hours and create some physical distance from the intensity of the past week. Marcus offered to accompany me for moral support, but I declined because the mysterious nature of the meeting made me feel like it was something I needed to face alone, that whatever information Robert Chun had left for me was meant to be received in solitude rather than with a witness present. The weekend passed quietly with me catching up on administrative work and spending Sunday afternoon with my friend Jennifer, who owned a bookstore in downtown Charleston, and who had become one of my closest confidants over the past 3 years. We had met at a small business owners networking event, and had bonded over shared experiences of building companies from nothing while navigating families who did not understand or value entrepreneurial paths. Jennifer had been one of the few people I had told about the wedding situation, and she had responded with fierce loyalty and practical support that included reminding me to eat and checking in daily to make sure I was functioning. She asked me Sunday afternoon what I hoped would be in the materials this mysterious Robert Chun had left for me, and I realized I had no idea how to answer. The question made me acknowledge that I had been deliberately not speculating about the contents because speculation felt dangerous, like allowing hope for something that might turn out to be disappointing or painful. Jennifer nodded with understanding and said that sometimes the best approach was to simply show up and let reality unfold without trying to control it through advanced prediction or preparation, that I had become skilled at showing up for difficult things and could trust myself to handle whatever this turned out to be. Tuesday morning arrived with overcast skies that matched my internal sense of apprehension as I drove south toward Savannah. The route took me through low-country landscape that I normally found beautiful, with Spanish moss hanging from live oaks and marshland stretching toward horizons that felt impossibly distant. I had made this drive dozens of times for various reasons over the years I had lived in Charleston, But today every mile felt weighted with significance I could not yet name. Eleanor Martinez's office was located in a renovated historic building in Savannah's downtown district, her second-floor suite decorated with elegant simplicity that spoke of professional success without ostentation. She greeted me warmly when her assistant showed me into her private office, a woman in her mid-50s with kind eyes, and the bearing of someone who had spent decades helping people navigate difficult emotional terrain around death and inheritance. She offered me coffee or tea, which I declined, and then she settled into the chair beside me rather than behind her desk in a deliberate choice that signaled this would be a personal conversation rather than a formal business transaction. She began by explaining that Robert Chun had been a commercial photographer who specialized in architectural and event documentation, that he had built a successful business over 40 years before retiring about 5 years ago, due to declining health. He had never married and had no children, but he had maintained close friendships throughout his life and had been particular about ensuring those friendships were honored in his estate planning. He had left most of his assets to various friends and charitable organizations, but he had set aside a specific collection of materials with instructions that they were to be delivered to me personally after his death along with a letter he had written explaining their significance. Eleanor opened a large flat file box that had been sitting on the credenza behind her desk and carefully removed its contents, spreading them across the conference table in her office. What I saw made my breath catch in my throat with confusion and recognition combined. Photographs. Dozens of photographs spanning what appeared to be decades, and in every single one I could see myself at various ages from childhood through the present day. There I was at about age 7, playing in a park I recognized from my childhood neighborhood, captured midlife in a candid moment. There I was at perhaps 13, walking out of what looked like my middle school carrying an overstuffed backpack. There I was at 17 in my high school graduation gown, standing on the steps of the auditorium looking simultaneously proud and uncertain. There I was at 22 at my college graduation, holding my diploma with a smile that did not quite reach my eyes. And then photograph after photograph documenting major and minor moments from my 20s and early 30s, including several from the Riverside Manor renovation showing me consulting with contractors or examining architectural details. The photographs were beautiful in a technical sense, composed with obvious skill and an artistic eye for light and moment. But the content was deeply disturbing because I had no memory of this Robert Chun person being present at any of these occasions, no awareness that I had been photographed at all these moments throughout my entire life. The collection represented surveillance in the literal sense, documentation of my existence by someone who had remained invisible to me, while apparently tracking my development across 3 decades. Eleanor watched my face as I processed what I was seeing, then quietly handed me an envelope with my name written across it in unfamiliar handwriting. She excused herself from the office to give me privacy to read whatever the letter contained, saying she would return in 15 minutes but that I should take whatever time I needed. The door closed softly behind her, and I was alone with photographs of my entire life, and a letter from a dead man I had never consciously met. My hands shook slightly as I opened the envelope, and began reading words that would fundamentally reframe my understanding of my own history. The letter began with an apology for the strangeness of the situation, acknowledging that receiving photographs and communication from an unknown person after their death was inherently unsettling, and that Robert hoped I would read the entire letter before making judgments about his intentions or his actions. He explained that he had been hired 30 years ago by someone who cared deeply about me to document my life from a distance, to create a visual record of my growth and achievements that would be preserved, even if I never knew it was being created. The person who had hired him had provided no explanation for why they wanted this documentation beyond saying that circumstances prevented them from being openly present in my life, but that they wanted to bear witness to my existence and development. Robert had accepted the assignment because he had been moved by the obvious love and grief in his client's request, and because he had been promised compensation generous enough to make the unusual nature of the work worthwhile. Over 3 decades he had photographed me at schools and parks and public events, always remaining unobtrusive and never interacting directly with me, or making his presence known. He wrote that watching me grow up through a camera lens had given him an unexpected investment in my well-being and success, that he had found himself genuinely hoping things would work out well for me, even though we had no direct relationship. He had witnessed moments of joy and moments of obvious pain, had captured my achievements and my struggles, and had developed a kind of avuncular affection for someone he observed but never knew personally. When his client had died 5 years ago, they had left instructions and funds for Robert to continue the documentation for as long as he was able, which he had done until his own declining health made the work impossible about a year before his death. The letter concluded with information that made my hands go completely numb and my vision narrow to a tunnel focused only on the words in front of me. Robert wrote that his client had been my biological father, a man named James Morrison who had been my mother's first serious boyfriend before she met and married my father. James had learned about my existence when I was about 5 years old through a chance encounter with my mother, and she had confirmed that I was his biological daughter but had made clear that her husband believed I was his child and that James's presence in my life would destroy her marriage and her family. James had agreed to stay away to protect my mother's secret, but he had asked only to be able to know about my life from a distance, to have some record that I existed and was growing up even if he could never claim me or be part of my life openly. I sat in that elegant office surrounded by evidence that I had been loved and observed by someone I had never known. Someone who had cared enough to spend significant resources documenting my existence across 3 decades. The photographs spread across the table represented a father who had been erased from my life before I even knew he existed, who had accepted exile in order to protect family secrets that had shaped my entire childhood without my knowledge or consent. Every awkward moment with my father, every instance of feeling like I did not quite belong in my own family, every experience of being treated as lesser than Vivian suddenly had a different explanatory framework. I had not been deficient or disappointing. I had been the living evidence of my mother's infidelity, the constant reminder of secrets that required my father to maintain emotional distance in order to protect his own ego and his marriage. The revelation recontextualized my entire life with such completeness that I felt physically disoriented, as though the ground beneath me had shifted, and I no longer knew which direction was up. The man I had called father for 33 years was not my biological father, which explains so much about the texture of our relationship and the particular flavor of his coldness toward me. My mother had maintained this massive secret my entire life, allowing me to believe I was part of a family unit that was actually built on lies and concealment. And my biological father had loved me enough to hire someone to document my life but not enough to fight for the right to be present in it, choosing to honor my mother's need for secrecy over his own desire for relationship with his daughter. I did not know how long I sat there staring at photographs and rereading the letter, but eventually Eleanor knocked softly and re-entered the office. She asked if I was all right, and I laughed at the absurdity of the question because I was very clearly not all right, but also there was no universe in which receiving information like this would leave anyone all right in any meaningful sense. She sat down across from me and explained that there were additional materials including detailed information about James Morrison's life, medical history that might be relevant for my own health care, and a substantial financial bequest that he had left for me in his will 5 years ago, but that had continued to grow through investment returns managed by Robert Chun as trustee. The bequest was significant enough to make me actually gasp when she stated the amount, nearly $1 million, that represented both James Morrison's original inheritance to me and 5 years of conservative investment growth. He had left me resources that would provide security and options, money that came with no strings or expectations beyond a letter he had written before his death expressing hope that I would use it in whatever ways brought me joy and served my dreams. The letter Robert Chun had given me included a copy of James's final letter to me, written when he knew he was dying and would never meet the daughter he had watched from shadows for 3 decades. James's letter was both heartbreaking and infuriating in its blend of love and acceptance of circumstances I would never find acceptable. He wrote about watching me grow up through Robert's photographs, about feeling pride when I accomplished things and helplessness when he could see through captured images that I was struggling or in pain. He described the particular torture of knowing he had a daughter but being prevented from acknowledging her, of loving someone from a distance so complete that she did not even know he existed. He expressed regret about honoring my mother's demand for secrecy rather than fighting for his right to be part of my life, acknowledging that he had chosen the easier path of distance, rather than the harder path of disrupting a secret that was never his responsibility to maintain. But he also wrote about understanding why my mother had made the choices she made, about recognizing that she had been young and scared, and trying to build a life that felt secure even if that security was based on concealment and lies. He described seeing me develop into someone with obvious strength and capability, Someone who survived and even thrived despite family dynamics he could see were difficult even from his distant vantage point. He expressed confidence that I would build a good life for myself regardless of the obstacles placed in my path, and he hoped that the resources he was leaving me would provide foundation and security for whatever I chose to create. The final paragraphs of his letter released me from any obligation to have feelings about him beyond whatever arose naturally, acknowledged that he had been a biological father but not a parent in any meaningful sense, and expressed simple gratitude that I had existed in the world even though he had not been permitted to know me. He wrote that I had been wanted and loved even if I had not known it, that my existence had mattered to him every single day of my life even though I had never felt his presence, and that he hoped someday I would understand that family love could exist across distance and silence even when it could not manifest in conventional relationship. Eleanor gave me space to read and cry and process before gently explaining the practical next steps regarding the financial bequest and the transfer of the photograph collection into my possession. She mentioned that Robert Chun had left instructions that I should feel free to do whatever I wanted with the photographs, including destroying them if having them felt more invasive than meaningful, that their purpose had been to document my life for James's benefit, but that now they belonged to me to use or dispose of as I saw fit. I told her I needed time to think about everything, that I could not make decisions about financial documents or photograph collections while my entire understanding of my own history was actively reorganizing itself around new information. She nodded with complete understanding and said that there was no urgency about any of the practical matters, that the estate could wait weeks or months if needed while I processed what I had learned. She provided me with copies of both letters along with a selection of photographs she thought might be particularly meaningful, promising to keep the full collection secure until I was ready to decide what I wanted done with it. The drive back to Charleston passed in a blur of thoughts and emotions that I could not organize into any coherent narrative. I pulled over twice because I was crying too hard to see the road safely, sitting in highway rest stops while I sobbed for the father I never knew I had and for the childhood I had lived without understanding its fundamental architecture. Every memory of feeling like I did not quite belong was now reframed with the knowledge that I literally did not belong in the genetic sense, that the family unit I had tried so desperately to fit into was actually built on a secret that made my inclusion impossible from the start. I thought about my mother maintaining this enormous lie for my entire life, watching me struggle to earn my father's love, while knowing that his coldness was rooted in knowledge about my paternity that I had been denied. I thought about my father, the man who had raised me, and tried to understand what it must have been like to look at a child who was living proof of his wife's infidelity, and to choose to stay in the marriage but to maintain emotional distance from that child as a form of self-protection. Neither of them had acted with my best interests as their primary concern. They had both made choices designed to protect themselves and their marriage, and I had paid the price through a childhood shaped by secrets I did not know existed. But I also thought about James Morrison, this biological father who had apparently loved me enough to spend enormous resources documenting my life but not enough to fight for the right to be present in it. His choice to honor my mother's demand for secrecy had been framed in his letter as noble sacrifice, but from my perspective, it looked more like taking the easier path. He could have fought for custody or visitation rights. He could have refused to be erased from my life. He could have insisted that I deserved to know the truth about my own parentage regardless of how that truth complicated my mother's marriage. Instead, he had chosen to love me from a distance that cost him nothing beyond money, and that cost me the opportunity to know I had a father who actually wanted me. When I finally arrived back at my apartment, I found Marcus sitting in the hallway outside my door, having apparently decided that I should not be alone after whatever the mysterious meeting had revealed. I collapsed into his arms without words and he held me while I cried, then guided me inside and made tea while I tried to form sentences that would explain what I had learned. The telling took nearly 2 hours because I kept having to stop and collect myself as new implications or emotions would surface, but Marcus listened with perfect attention and asked questions that helped me work through my thinking about what all of this meant. He pointed out something I had not yet consciously registered, which was that my parents now had significant motivation to reveal the truth about my parentage as a way to explain or justify their treatment of me. If they could position me as not really being my father's daughter, they could reframe their favoritism toward Vivian as natural preference for their actual biological child rather than as the cruelty it had appeared to be when I thought we shared the same parentage. The secret that had been maintained to protect their marriage could now be weaponized to protect their image, to provide an explanation for their behavior that cast them as victims of difficult circumstances, rather than as people who had chosen to treat a child badly. The realization made me feel physically sick because I knew Marcus was absolutely right. Once I confronted them with my knowledge about James Morrison, they would almost certainly try to use that information to justify decades of dismissal and coldness. They would claim they had been in an impossible situation, forced to raise another man's child while maintaining the fiction of family unity. They would position themselves as having done the best they could under difficult circumstances, and they would expect me to be grateful that they had stayed together and provided for me materially even if they could not provide emotional warmth or genuine acceptance. Marcus asked what I wanted to do with the information, whether I planned to confront my parents or whether I preferred to simply know the truth without forcing them to acknowledge it. The question made me realize I had not yet thought about next steps because I was still processing the reality of the revelation itself. But as we talked, I began to understand that I needed them to know that I knew that keeping this as my private knowledge would leave me in a position where I understood our family dynamics, but they remained oblivious to how much I had discovered. I wanted them to experience the discomfort of having their secrets revealed, of having to face someone who knew the truth they had worked so hard to conceal. That evening, I drafted a letter that would be the second major communication with my parents in 2 weeks, though this one carried far more emotional weight than the documentation about Riverside Manor had. I explained that I had recently learned about my biological parentage through materials left to me by Robert Chen and James Morrison, that I now understood the fundamental lie that had shaped my entire childhood, and that I recognized their treatment of me had been rooted in secrets I had never been permitted to know. I wrote that I understood why they had made the choices they made, but that understanding did not translate to acceptance or forgiveness, that protecting their marriage and their image had been more important to them than my well-being or my right to know my own truth. I told them that I was not interested in having lengthy conversations about the circumstances or hearing explanations about why they had felt maintaining secrecy was necessary. I simply wanted them to know that I knew that the foundation of lies they had built our family on was now visible to me, and that any future interactions between us would be based on this shared knowledge rather than on continued concealment. I mentioned the financial inheritance from James Morrison, so they would understand I now had resources that made me completely independent of any potential support or assistance they might have imagined I needed from them. The letter concluded with a statement that felt important even though I knew it would probably hurt them or make them angry. I wrote that I was grateful to James Morrison for caring enough about me to document my life and to provide for my future, and that I wished he had fought harder to be present in my life rather than accepting the role of invisible observer. I noted that his love from a distance had been real but inadequate, but that it still represented more genuine care for my well-being than I had ever received from the people who raised me, and who should have loved me without conditions or reservations. Marcus read the letter and suggested only minor edits for clarity, agreeing that the tone struck the right balance between honesty and restraint. We decided to send it via email rather than courier because this information did not require formal delivery, and because email would prevent them from claiming they had not received it or had not read it. I hit send at 9:30 Tuesday evening, and then turned off my phone because I had no interest in receiving immediate responses, while I was still processing the day's revelations. Wednesday morning arrived with a strange sense of calm that felt surprising given the emotional intensity of the previous day. I woke early and went for a run along the Battery, letting the physical exertion work through some of the restless energy that had been building since the meeting with Eleanor Martinez. The photographs from Robert Chun kept playing through my mind, specific images surfacing at random moments, and each one prompting new questions or realizations about my own history. There was one photograph in particular that I could not stop thinking about, an image of me at perhaps 16 years old sitting alone on a bench at what looked like a school sporting event. The expression on my face was distant and lonely in a way that made my chest hurt to see, clear evidence of the isolation I had felt during those years but that I had never fully acknowledged to myself at the time. James Morrison had seen that photograph and had known his daughter was struggling, had witnessed my loneliness through Robert's documentation, but had chosen to remain invisible, rather than disrupting the secret that kept us apart. I could not decide if I was more angry at him for his passivity or grateful that he had cared enough to pay attention from whatever distance he was allowed. Both responses felt true simultaneously, creating an emotional complexity that resisted resolution into simple feelings. He had been present in the only way he knew how given the constraints placed on him, But those constraints had been negotiated by adults making choices designed to protect themselves, with my well-being as at best a secondary consideration. No one in this story had put me first. Not my mother, who had lied to protect her marriage. Not the man who raised me, who had punished me for existing. And not James Morrison, who had loved me but not enough to fight for me. By mid-morning I could no longer ignore my phone, and when I finally turned it back on, I found 17 missed calls from my mother, and a series of increasingly desperate text messages asking me to call her immediately. There was nothing from my father, which felt consistent with his general approach to difficult emotional situations, which was to delegate them to my mother and then support whatever position she took. I did not call back, instead sending a brief text saying I had nothing to add to what I had written in the email, and suggesting that they take whatever time they needed to process the information before we had any further communication. My mother called again within minutes of my text being delivered, and this time I answered because avoiding her indefinitely felt like giving her too much power over my peace of mind. Her voice was distraught in a way I had rarely heard, high-pitched and rushed as she tried to explain everything at once. She talked about how young she had been, how confused about what she wanted, how James Morrison had been her first love, but how she had known he was not stable enough to build a life with. She described finding out she was pregnant after he had already left Charleston for a job opportunity in Atlanta, how terrified she had been about what it would mean for her future and her family's reputation. She explained that my father, the man who raised me, had known about the pregnancy from the beginning and had chosen to marry her anyway and to claim me as his own child. She presented this as a noble sacrifice on his part, evidence of his love for her and his commitment to their relationship. She mentioned that they had agreed never to tell me the truth because they believed it would be less damaging for me to grow up thinking I belonged to both of them, rather than knowing that my biological father had not chosen to be part of my life. She claimed they had been trying to protect me from pain and confusion, that every choice they had made had been motivated by love, even if I could not see it that way now. I listened to her entire explanation without interrupting, noting the familiar pattern of framing choices that served her interests as choices made for my benefit. When she finally paused for breath, I asked a single question that cut through all her justifications. I asked why, if they had been so concerned with protecting me from pain, they had treated me with coldness and dismissal my entire life. I pointed out that their protection had apparently extended only to concealing information, not to actually providing the kind of love and acceptance that might have made the secret less damaging. I noted that they could have maintained the lie about my paternity while still treating me with genuine warmth and inclusion, but they had chosen to do neither. My mother had no good answer to that, falling back on vague statements about how complicated the situation had been, and how they had done their best under difficult circumstances. I told her that I was sure they believed that was true, but that their best had not been good enough, that I had paid the price for secrets and choices that were never mine to carry. I said that I understood they had been young and scared and trying to build a life that felt secure, but that their security had come at the cost of my childhood and my sense of belonging in my own family. Then I told her something I had not planned to say but that came out with absolute clarity and conviction. I said that I was grateful to James Morrison not because he had been a good father, because he had not been a father to me at all in any meaningful sense, but because his documentation and his inheritance had given me proof that I had been wanted by someone, that my existence had mattered to someone enough that they paid attention across decades even when they could not be present. I told her that the photographs Robert Chun had taken were evidence that at least one person had seen me clearly and had thought I was worth watching, which was more than I could say about the people who had raised me, and who should have treasured me but who had instead made me feel invisible and unworthy my entire life. The conversation ended badly, with my mother crying and saying I was being unfair, and refusing to understand their perspective. I ended the call feeling drained but also strangely liberated, as though speaking these truths aloud had released something that had been trapped inside me for decades. I knew we would likely have more conversations in the coming weeks or months, that this would not be the final word on revelations that had appended our family's founding mythology. But I also knew that I had said what needed to be said, that I had refused to accept their reframing of cruelty as protection, and that I had claimed my right to name what I had experienced rather than accepting their preferred narrative. The rest of Wednesday passed in a kind of fog as I tried to focus on work while my mind kept returning to photographs and letters and revelations about the fundamental architecture of my own life. I had built my entire identity around being the disappointing daughter, the one who did not quite fit, the one whose presence somehow created problems. Now I understood that my failure to belong had been inevitable from the start, that I had been trying to earn inclusion in a family unit that was structurally designed to exclude me, because my very existence threatened secrets that required my marginalization to maintain. That knowledge did not heal the wounds or erase the damage, but it did provide a framework for understanding that took some of the weight off my own shoulders. I had not been deficient or broken or inherently unlovable. I had been inconvenient to people who were trying to maintain comfortable lives, and they had responded to that inconvenience by making me feel like the problem was mine rather than theirs. The truth was finally visible, painful and clarifying in equal measure, and I would spend years working to integrate it into a coherent understanding of who I was and where I had come from. But in that moment, sitting in my apartment on Wednesday evening surrounded by photographs of a life I had lived without knowing I was being witnessed, I felt something unexpected. Not happiness or peace or any of the emotions that might suggest healing or resolution. Instead, I felt seen. For the first time in my life, I had evidence that someone had paid attention, that someone had thought I mattered enough to document my existence across decades. The attention had come from someone I never knew and had arrived only after his death, but it was still more than I had ever received from the people whose love I had spent my life trying to earn. And that, I realized, was both profoundly sad and strangely hopeful. Because if James Morrison had seen something in me worth loving even from a distance, even through photographs taken by a hired observer, then maybe I actually was worth loving. Maybe the failure had been in my parents' ability to see clearly rather than in my inherent lovability. Maybe I had been enough all along, and they had simply been too committed to their lies and their self-protection to recognize what had been in front of them my entire life. The truth was out now, all of it, spreading across my understanding like light through a prism revealing colors that had always been present but invisible. And whatever came next would unfold with that truth as foundation rather than the lies that had shaped everything that came before. The days following my conversation with my mother unfolded with a clarity of purpose I had not experienced in years. Something fundamental had shifted inside me during that phone call, a recognition that I was finished explaining myself to people who were committed to misunderstanding me and finished accepting cruelty disguised as protection. The revelations about my paternity had provided the final piece of context I needed to understand that my family's treatment of me had never been about my inadequacies but had always been about their need to protect lies that were more valuable to them than my well-being. Thursday morning I called Michael Chun, my attorney who had helped prepare the documentation packet about Riverside Manor, and scheduled an appointment to discuss more comprehensive legal protections. The inheritance from James Morrison meant I now had substantial assets that required proper legal structuring, but more importantly I wanted to establish clear boundaries and protections that would prevent my parents from attempting to insert themselves into my financial affairs or business operations. Michael had handled enough family dispute cases to immediately understand what I needed without requiring extensive explanation, and he scheduled me for a 2-hour consultation the following Monday to begin putting proper structures in place. I also reached out to Eleanor Martinez in Savannah to begin the process of accepting the inheritance and transferring the photograph collection to my possession. She walked me through the necessary paperwork with patience and sensitivity, explaining each document's purpose and ensuring I understood the tax implications and administrative requirements. The financial transfer would take several weeks to complete because of the various accounts and investments that needed to be consolidated and retitled, but she assured me that everything was structured properly, and that James Morrison's estate planning had been meticulous in its attention to detail. Eleanor mentioned during our conversation that she had handled James Morrison's estate planning documents when he first learned he was terminally ill, and that she had been struck by how much thought and care he had put into the provisions for me. He had apparently asked extensive questions about how to structure the inheritance in ways that would provide maximum benefit and flexibility, inquiring about educational trusts and business investment vehicles and various options that would have been relevant if I had been younger or in different circumstances. She said it was clear he had wanted to provide for me in ways that honored whatever choices I had made about my own life, rather than imposing conditions or expectations based on what he might have wanted for me. The detail Eleanor shared made my feelings about James Morrison even more complicated than they already were. He had cared enough to plan carefully for my future, had invested mental and emotional energy into ensuring his inheritance would actually serve my needs rather than simply being a generic financial transfer. But he had not cared enough to fight for the right to know me while he was alive, had not prioritized relationship with his biological daughter over respect for my mother's demand for secrecy. The contradiction between his obvious investment in my well-being and his acceptance of exile from my life remained difficult to reconcile. Marcus and I spent Thursday afternoon in my office at Riverside Manor reviewing the business financials and discussing how the inheritance from James Morrison might be deployed strategically if I chose to invest it in the company. We had been operating successfully for 5 years, but there were expansion opportunities we had been evaluating that would require significant capital investment. The inheritance could fund renovation of a second property we had been considering, or could provide reserve funds that would allow us to weather economic downturns without compromising service quality, or could support development of additional service offerings that would diversify our revenue streams. The conversation felt grounding in its focus on concrete plans and practical decisions, rather than on emotional processing of family dysfunction. Marcus was skilled at helping me think through business strategy in ways that balanced ambition with realistic assessment of resources and risks, and working through various scenarios gave me something productive to focus on beyond the churning emotions that had dominated the past week. We ultimately decided to wait several months before making any major decisions about deploying the inheritance, agreeing that I needed time to process everything that had happened before committing to business directions that would be difficult to reverse once implemented. Carolina knocked on my office door around 4 in the afternoon with news that initially seemed routine, but that would prove to have unexpected implications. She reported that we had received an inquiry about hosting a major corporate event in October, a pharmaceutical company's regional conference that would require booking the entire property for 3 days, and would represent one of our largest contracts of the year. The inquiry had come through our standard channels and she had already sent our information packet and pricing structure, but she wanted to flag for me that the client contact's last name was Foster, and she wanted to confirm how I wanted her to handle the situation if this turned out to be a family connection. The name on the inquiry was Richard Foster, my uncle and my father's business partner, the same man who had been with my father in the hallway at Riverside Manor during Vivian's wedding when my father had first recognized me and decided to have me removed. Richard ran a successful pharmaceutical distribution company that frequently hosted regional conferences and events, and it made sense that he would be seeking a venue with the capacity and prestige level we offered. But the timing was notable, coming less than 2 weeks after his brother had physically removed me from my own property, apparently still unaware that I was the owner of the venue he was now inquiring about booking. I told Carolina to handle the inquiry exactly as she would any other prospective client, providing information and pricing and moving through our standard consultation process without any indication that I had personal connection to the company or the contact person. I wanted to see how far this would progress before anyone in my family realized they were again attempting to book my venue, whether they had learned anything from the revelation about Vivian's wedding or whether they remained so oblivious to my actual professional identity that they would make the same mistake twice. There was a certain grim satisfaction in watching this situation develop, knowing that I held information they lacked, and that their ignorance was about to create another uncomfortable moment of recognition. Marcus pointed out that this inquiry presented an interesting strategic opportunity if I chose to use it. I could allow the booking to proceed and then reveal my ownership at the last moment, creating maximum discomfort and forcing my family to either cancel and lose their deposit or proceed with an event at a venue owned by the niece they had dismissed. Alternatively, I could have Carolina inform them of my ownership early in the process and let them make an informed decision about whether they wanted to book with us. Or I could simply decline the booking without explanation, exercising my right as a business owner to choose which clients we worked with and opting out of any further entanglement with my family's events. The options were all viable from a business standpoint, but they required me to decide what I actually wanted my relationship with my family to look like going forward. Did I want ongoing opportunities to demonstrate my success and force them to confront their misjudgments? Did I prefer clean separation where we had no intersection points in our professional or personal lives? Did I want to establish some kind of civil but distant relationship where we could interact around necessary business or family matters, while maintaining clear boundaries? The inquiry from Richard Foster was forcing me to think through questions I had been avoiding about what kind of future relationship, if any, I wanted with people who had caused so much pain but who were still technically my family. I spent Thursday evening with Jennifer at her bookstore after closing, sitting in the comfortable chairs in the reading section while she worked on inventory, and I processed aloud through the various decisions I needed to make. Jennifer had a gift for asking questions that clarified my own thinking without imposing her opinions or trying to direct me toward particular conclusions. She asked what outcome would allow me to sleep peacefully at night 6 months from now, what choice would minimize regret regardless of how my family responded, and what decision would reflect the person I wanted to be rather than simply reacting to the person they had made me feel like I was. Her questions helped me recognize that my desire to create uncomfortable situations for my family was rooted in pain and anger that were completely valid, but that would not actually heal me or change them. They would either learn from these experiences and grow into better people, or they would not. I could not control their growth or force them to acknowledge what they had done wrong. I could only control my own choices and my own behavior, and I wanted those choices to reflect integrity and self-respect, rather than being primarily motivated by desire to cause discomfort or prove points to people who had already demonstrated their inability to see me clearly. By the time I left Jennifer's bookstore around 9 that evening, I had reached clarity about several key decisions. I would instruct Carolina to inform Richard Foster early in the consultation process that I owned Riverside Manor, giving him full information to make an informed choice about whether to proceed with the booking. I would not actively try to make the situation uncomfortable or awkward, but I would also not hide my ownership or pretend to be someone other than who I was. If he chose to proceed with the booking despite knowing I owned the venue, we would provide the same excellent service we offered all clients, and I would maintain appropriate professional boundaries. If he chose to book elsewhere, that was his prerogative, and I would not take it personally or view it as rejection. I would also begin the process of establishing clear boundaries around what kinds of contact I would accept from my parents and under what circumstances. Michael Chun would help me draft a formal communication outlining these boundaries, making clear that I was not interested in lengthy processing conversations about the past or hearing justifications for their choices, but that I was willing to maintain civil contact around necessary practical matters if they could respect boundaries I was establishing. The boundaries would include things like advance notice required for any communication, topics that were off-limits for discussion, and consequences for violation of the stated boundaries. Most significantly, I decided to use a portion of James Morrison's inheritance to fund a scholarship program specifically for young adults who had experienced family estrangement or parental rejection. The program would provide financial support for education or business development to people who were trying to build lives without family resources or support, who were navigating the world without the safety net that comes from having parents who believe in you and invest in your success. The scholarship would be named the James Morrison Second Chances Fund, acknowledging both his financial contribution and the reality that he had missed his chance at being a present father, but that his resources could give others chances he had not taken for himself. The scholarship idea had emerged during my conversation with Jennifer, as we discussed what would give meaning to the inheritance beyond just personal financial security. Jennifer had suggested that transforming my painful family history into resources for others facing similar challenges would be a way of ensuring that something good came from all the dysfunction and hurt. The suggestion resonated immediately, feeling like it honored both James Morrison's care for me and my own experience of building a life without family support. If I could use his resources to make that process easier for others, then perhaps the complicated legacy of invisible love from a distant father could serve a purpose beyond just my own healing. Friday morning I met with Marcus to formalize the structure of the scholarship fund, working with him to develop criteria and application processes that would identify candidates who would genuinely benefit from financial support combined with mentorship. We decided to start small with 2 scholarships per year of $20,000 each, enough to make a real difference without overextending before we understood how to effectively administer the program. Marcus volunteered to serve on the selection committee, along with Jennifer and a social worker friend of mine named Patricia, who specialized in working with young adults experiencing family crisis. The work of developing the scholarship program provided a productive channel for the energy I might otherwise have spent dwelling on family dysfunction or planning confrontations that would not actually serve my healing. There was something deeply satisfying about taking resources that existed because of a father who had remained invisible and using them to support young people who were becoming visible in their own right despite families that had tried to diminish them. The parallel was obvious but not overly neat, allowing for genuine meaning without collapsing into simplistic redemption narrative about pain being transformed into purpose. Carolina called me Friday afternoon with an update on the Richard Foster inquiry. She had reached out to schedule the standard venue tour and consultation meeting, and during that conversation had mentioned as part of our normal introduction that the property was owned and operated by me. There had been a long pause on the phone according to Carolina, followed by Richard asking her to repeat the ownership information, apparently needing confirmation that he had heard correctly. Carolina had professionally confirmed that yes, I was the owner and CEO of Riverside Manor and had been for 5 years, and that I was personally involved in all major events, though I maintained a relatively low profile with most clients. Richard had thanked her for the information and said he would need to consult with his team before moving forward with the booking process. Carolina reported that his tone had shifted notably after learning about my ownership, becoming more formal and distant where he had previously been warm and engaging. She asked whether I wanted her to follow up proactively or wait for him to reconnect if he decided to proceed, and I told her to simply note in our system that we had provided information, and to wait for him to make the next move. If he chose to book with us, we would welcome the business. If he chose to go elsewhere, we had plenty of other inquiries and did not need his event to fill our calendar. The response from Richard felt predictable, and also revealing about how my family operated when confronted with information that complicated their preferred narratives. Rather than acknowledging directly that he now understood his niece owned a successful business or expressing any interest in my professional achievements, he simply withdrew to consult with his team as though my ownership was a logistical complication to be managed rather than information that might prompt reflection about how family members had dismissed and underestimated me. The pattern of avoiding direct acknowledgement while adjusting behavior to account for new information was consistent with decades of family dynamics where uncomfortable truths were managed through distance and silence, rather than through honest conversation. Saturday morning brought an unexpected visitor to my apartment. I was working at my dining table reviewing applications for an assistant events coordinator position we were hiring for, when my building's doorman called to say that my sister Vivian was in the lobby asking if she could come up to speak with me. The request surprised me enough that I initially did not respond, trying to process what it might mean that Vivian had apparently tracked down my address and shown up unannounced less than 2 weeks after her wedding where I had been physically removed by our father. I told the doorman to let her come up, deciding that I preferred to have whatever conversation she wanted on my own territory rather than in some neutral public location. I used the 5 minutes before she knocked on my door to clear my workspace and compose myself, recognizing that I had no idea what to expect from this interaction or what Vivian's motivations might be for seeking me out. We had not spoken directly in 3 years beyond the brief moment in the bridal suite when she had said my presence at her wedding was fine as long as I stayed out of sight, and we had certainly not had any substantive conversation about our relationship or family dynamics. When I opened the door, I was struck by how different Vivian looked from the polished bride I had seen in Riverside Manor's bridal suite 2 weeks earlier. She was wearing jeans and a simple sweater with no makeup and her hair pulled back in a casual ponytail, looking younger and more vulnerable than I had seen her appear in years. Her eyes were red-rimmed in a way that suggested recent crying, and she was holding a large envelope that she clutched with both hands as though it provided some kind of security or purpose. She asked if she could come in, and I stepped aside to let her enter my apartment. She looked around with obvious curiosity, taking in the space I had created for myself with its mix of comfortable furniture and carefully curated art, and the kind of personal touches that revealed actual personality rather than designer-approved styling. I watched her observe my life through the physical evidence of my living space, and I wondered what conclusions she was drawing about the sister she apparently knew so little about despite sharing childhood and family. We sat in my living room with the kind of awkward formality that characterized interactions between people who were related by blood, but not by any meaningful connection or shared understanding. Vivian opened the conversation by saying she owed me an apology for what had happened at her wedding, that she had not known our father was going to physically remove me, and that if she had known she would have intervened. The apology felt both genuine and insufficient, acknowledging one specific incident, while avoiding the larger patterns that had preceded and enabled that incident. I asked her directly whether she had known about my biological paternity, whether she had been aware that the man we called father was not actually my father in the genetic sense. Her face answered before her words did, an expression of shock and confusion that made clear she had not known this particular secret. She asked what I was talking about, and I found myself having to explain to my sister that we were actually half-sisters, that our mother had conceived me with someone else before marrying the man we called father, and that this secret had apparently been maintained throughout our entire childhood by parents who had thought protecting their marriage was more important than honoring truth or treating me with genuine acceptance. Vivian's response to this information was more emotional than I had anticipated. She started crying in a way that seemed to come from somewhere deep and genuine, saying that so many things suddenly made sense about our childhood and our parents' differential treatment of us. She described always having felt vaguely guilty about being favored without understanding why, feeling like there was something wrong with enjoying parental approval when it came so easily to her while being systematically withheld from me. She said she had sometimes tried to intervene or advocate for me when we were children, but that our parents had been so consistent in their dismissal of me that eventually she had stopped trying and had simply accepted that this was how our family functioned. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.